In today's Zoffy, we're going to be talking about Alberta politics, and that always is tremendous interest because it's a little, what we call interesting these days. And we're going to be joined by Janet Brown and John Santos, who are pollsters, and they have some really interesting data and insights into the tie between Alberta cultural and political identity and the oil and gas industry. So welcome to the Zoffy, Janet and John.
Thanks for having us.
Now, John, I'm going to direct the first question to you. You wrote a very, very interesting piece for CBC about a week ago. And could you give us a little overview and summary of that piece, please?
So this piece was reporting on a question we asked on the third survey that we conducted for CBC Calgary as part of the Road Ahead series. And this was an open-ended question just asking people, what are some things that Alberta needs to do to get its economy back on track? And it was completely open-ended. We didn't provide a, usual strongly agree, somewhat agree kind of response set that most survey questions does. So people, and it was an online survey. So, and it was taken during, lockdown. And so people had the opportunity to write whatever they want and however long they wanted to. And, just, it's not reported in the piece, but the longest response was actually almost 2,000 characters. And you copy and paste it into Microsoft Word to read it, and it looks like a long form answer to a university exam essay question. And so these responses really provide a window into what people are thinking, because there's no prompt, there's no telling people how to structure it. And it gets difficult to read 900 responses, especially if some of them are over 1,000 characters. And so we put it through a statistical meat grinder called topic modeling, or latent Dirichlet allocation. And that model classified the responses into 4 categories. And we called the categories economic diversification. So these people were mentioning things like Alberta needs to get away from oil and gas, Alberta needs more renewables, Alberta needs to develop a tech sector, that sort of thing. And then we called another category doubling down on oil, because these people, either expressed outright skepticism towards transitioning to renewables, or they said that oil and gas is what Alberta is, and we need to protect that, we need to strengthen that, we need to safeguard it away from, Ottawa and Quebec and Ontario and equalization and all these other threats. And then there were 2 smaller sets of responses. One set could be classified under the topic of controlling the pandemic, so that the economy can reopen, right? So things like contact tracing, getting businesses open, that sort of thing. And then the 4th topic was government supports, or things that government can do, government actions to help people, society, businesses, organizations during this time. And the first 2 topics that I mentioned, diversification and doubling down on oil, accounted for 60% of the responses. And it was split evenly down the middle. Like 30% of people said diversification, 29% said double down on oil. And so, again, this question was unstructured. And so it was really interesting for this to come out, because over the course of this research that Janet and I have been doing for CBC, we've asked other questions about energy transition. And what we're seeing is that this is the divide. And this is going to be an even bigger divide in Alberta politics, right? This is going to be one of those key dimensions where people sort themselves out, and it's going to play into how they, the kinds of policies that they produce or support, and how they ultimately vote at the ballot box.
Now, this is fascinating for me, folks, because really the editorial mission of Energy Media, and has been since 2015, is to report about the energy transition and its implications for Canada, but most specifically in our day-to-day reporting, Alberta. And the data is incontrovertible. It was in 2015, I used to get pushback all the time from people who said, just because you spell energy transition with a capital E and a capital T doesn't make it real. But that's changed. And I think that now we recognize, even the most ardent oil and gas supporters realize that we're going an energy transition. But here's the thing. I still believe, and I think your data, John, supports this, that there are a sizable number of people who really think that the changes that are coming are not structural, they're cyclical. that really what we're seeing is another, cycle in the oil and gas markets that we've seen, I don't know how many times since 1947, but a lot. It's the nature of oil and gas, actually. And they believe that the climate policies, energy transition policies are really ideologically driven. They're not driven in response to real things. They're driven in response to, liberal or left of center kinds of ideology. And then there are the folks who really would agree, I guess, with our editorial position, which is that new energy technologies like wind and solar and electric cars and battery storage and all of that sort of thing are actually driving structural changes to markets, and Alberta has to pivot and adapt in order to maintain its prosperity. Have I kind of got the divide right, John?
Yeah, I think, I think that really hits on it, because it's not that people want, like to say that the Alberta industry, oil industry, should stop tomorrow, I think is very much a minority position. Because, in our last wave of the survey, 92% of Albertans say that Alberta should do more to support to encourage the development of the tech sector. 79% of Albertans say Alberta should transition towards renewable energy, right? So there's this idea that, Alberta needs to do something. I think part of the debate rests on, what should we do with the oil and gas industry, and how long is that going to be around? And that's where the split, it was basically 50-50 in our March survey, whether or not Alberta should transition away from oil and gas. And it continues to be 50-50 in the most recent survey. It's just sort of polarized, with more people saying strongly agree or disagree rather than somewhat agree or disagree.
And I want to jump in here with some observations about Alberta, about the political culture and some of the questions we pose, because this shibboleth, if you will, this idea that we should stop oil and gas tomorrow, even amongst the ENGOs, the environmental groups, I know very few people who argue that we should stop oil and gas tomorrow or even in the near future. They recognize that this is a transition of multiple decades long, and they want to see it phased out perhaps, but stop in the short term. Everybody I know recognizes that that's not an option, and it's just not going to happen. It's not realistic. The other part of this question is, I think we have created a false dichotomy. It's not a question of do we have oil and gas or we don't have oil and gas. It's a question is, as the global energy system changes, what should we do with our oil and gas? And I keep coming back to an op-ed that came out about a month ago in Corporate Knights by Mark Little, the CEO of Suncor, and Laura Kilcrease, the CEO of Alberta Innovates. And Little, this is the biggest oil and gas company in Canada, said, we think markets are changing faster than we had previously expected. We need to move into bitumen beyond combustion, which is basically you take bitumen and you manufacture it into carbon fiber. So you make material out of it instead of sending it off to a refinery to be made into fuel. And if you pose it that way, you get an entirely different conversation than if it's yes, oil and gas, or no oil and gas. What does the data say about that conversation, John?
Well,
I'm going to let Janet, because she's you can jump in here.
Well, I think it's fair to characterize our data as sort of split 50-50, right? That you've got half of the population that's probably, more geared to sort of oil and gas and rejuvenating that industry, and half that's sort of prepared to move beyond it. But that's an oversimplification. And I think it's fair to say, we said this a lot when we've been interpreting this survey, it's fair to say that most people can walk and chew gum at the same time. So, there are people on the very extremes who think it's one or the other. Interestingly, we are seeing growth at the extremes, but still, the big mushy middle is able to sort of see both. And when you do a focus group with people and you ask people to sort of talk through this stuff, it's for some people, it's not really an either or. It's almost like sort of a short-term, long-term thing, right? Like, staunch sort of supporters of the oil and gas industry will say, like, I know oil and gas and energy has to look different in the future, but what do we do here in Alberta until that happens, right? So they see supporting our oil and gas sector as a short-term solution, but it doesn't mean they're oblivious to the need for a long-term solution. And yeah, like I said, most Albertans in the mushy middle can walk and chew gum at the same time. But at the same time, there's, from a political point of view, there are these two camps emerging. You know, one that wants to staunchly defend the industry, you know, one that wants the industry to move along.
We had, last week we had Monica Gattinger on, who's the CEO of Positive Energy and a professor at the University of Ottawa, to talk about polarization of energy debate in Canada. And she talked about these two camps that you just described. And the question was, of course, how do you get to some kind of third camp in the middle, where you can move together on a consensus and you can put in place the policies that are really needed to support both the oil and gas industry and the energy transition. So the old, you know, how do you have policy that reflects, you know, walking and chewing gum at the same time, I guess, to use your metaphor. So what's your take on that, Janet? I mean, what does the data say, and what are your observations based on the work that you've been doing?
Well, as I just said, I mean, from a political point of view, it's shaping up to be, you know, quite a divisive debate and quite a binary debate. But you know, if you spend too much time on Twitter, and you know, you're going to get the impression that the debate is probably more divisive than it is. And so, you know, I do think that there's you know, a lot of Albertans who are ready to have a thoughtful conversation on this, but I'm not sure that there's sort of many arenas where it's possible to have that thoughtful conversation. And you know, John, in his article, he pulled out a couple of really colorful quotes from the research, and they were typical in terms of the topics they addressed, but they weren't typical in sort of the passion that was in them. But we pulled them out because they were such passionate statements. But you know, most people can sit down in a room and have a reasonable conversation about this. It's just, you just never see that on Twitter, and also in a survey when somebody's just sitting alone, you don't get to see how their ability to engage in a dialogue either.
If I could just jump in with a bit of a primer for the folks here on like, you know, what like the political science literature says about like opinion formation, because, you know, we tend to think about the distribution of public opinion, right, as this normal curve, right, with, you know, a lot of people in the middle, and then there's fewer people that go to the extremes. And, you know, sort of the idea from classical economic thinking, if you think Anthony Downs and economic theory of democracy, right, is that it's a proximity-based thing, right? And that, you know, if a politician or leader suggests an action here, that people on either side of the issue who are closest to it will move towards it. Well, most of the research actually says that's not how mass opinion moves in a society, and that it's rather directional, right? And so there isn't this flight to the middle of positions. Rather, what happens is people, you know, will gravitate towards a position taken by a leader or a party that even though it might be a bit more on the extreme, if it's on their side, they'll move towards it, right? And so, you know, if we conceptualize or visualize this normal distribution, and like, you know, somebody is just slightly, let's say, right of center, if you know, a party suggests something that's on the right of them, that person is more likely to move towards that direction rather than move towards the left, even if that left position is closer in ideological space, right? And I think that's part of what's driving this polarization, is that these ideas are very complex. Nobody knows when the transition is going to happen, right? And so what happens is the people who want it sooner, you know, their position gets sort of tropified into this, well, it has to happen tomorrow. And the people who want it longer, their position gets tropified as saying, well, we never want it to happen at all.
Well, I want to throw out a little hypothesis for you then, and I made this in my book, The New Alberta Advantage, last year, and that is Rachel Notley's policies and the Climate Leadership Plan, plus the energy policies that were consistent with it, basically was meant to and I asked the Premier this when I interviewed her for the book, they were meant to help Alberta begin pivoting towards the energy transition and a low carbon future. But I made the argument in the book that her government, and she specifically, did not do a very good job of advancing the narrative around that objective. And so Mark McQuaid-Boyd, who was the energy minister, and Mark, we've had chats about this, and she agrees that she was not a great salesperson for those policies. Shannon Phillips was not very good at advancing the narratives. It wasn't her shtick. And Notley herself gravitates more towards, you know, social issues than she did these energy issues, and didn't do a very good job advancing the narrative. They really didn't have a narrative. In fact, it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is to connect the dots for Albertans on what was some pretty good policy. And what the point I'm getting at here is that because there aren't two narratives really within the Alberta political culture, there really is only one narrative, which is the protect the, and I'm talking about publicly from political leadership, which is, you know, the oil and gas booster side. And then the other narrative comes from outside. It comes from BC, or it comes from Quebec, or you know, the Trudeau government. And that makes for not a very healthy discussion, because it quickly becomes this populist kind of thing where Albertans are under attack, and the government had, you know, Premier Kenny and the UCP have to, you know, protect the people and the industry and jobs and so on. And my hypothesis is this, folks, and either one of you can answer this, is that Alberta would be better suited if it had another narrative that could compete with that dominant narrative, and we would be better informed as a result of it. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to kind of give the folksy answer, and John can probably give a more political science answer. But, you know, our politics in Alberta here is very much formed by the primary resource, right? It's just, you know, lots of scholars have written about, you know, the importance of the industry and how that really shapes our political culture here in Alberta. And so, you know, the fact that we're sort of a resource-based economy, or have historically been, maybe we're not going to be in the future, but we have historically been, we have sort of one party that has that, we have the right-wing narrative for our energy economy, but we don't have the left-wing narrative. And I think you're absolutely right in your assessment that the NDP might have had very good policy, and policy that should have been very acceptable to the average Albertan. But, you know, as we know through communications, people don't often remember what we said. They remember how we made them feel. And Albertans just couldn't get over the feeling that they didn't think that the NDP got it, that they didn't think that the NDP was really committed to these ideas. And they just, and you know, you can't look at the policy and say, well, why didn't Albertans embrace this policy? Well, it was just a lack of trust, you know, in the messenger, and so they never gave those policies a chance.
Yeah, I think those are fair comments. John, do you have any insights?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Like, I mean, one of the dangers about being a resource-based economy, and like Harold Innis wrote about this like 70, 80 years ago, right? Is like, I mean, you're not just vulnerable to commodity prices, right? But like, you become vulnerable to this colonial mentality, right? That all you're good for is to be a fetcher of water and hewer of wood, right? And anything that gets in the way of you fetching water and hewing wood is this detrimental, you know, existential threat to you, right? When instead it's like, well, what can I do with this water, and what can I do with this wood? You know, and I mean, the economic difficulties of upgrading aside, right? I think that some of the proponents of domestic upgrading and increased refining sort of get that. And it is unfortunate that we've sort of condemned ourselves to this mentality of thinking that all we're good for is getting stuff out of the ground instead of doing something.
Yeah,
with it.
and too easily, like, you know, just a little over a year ago, we had an election here, and the NDP just sort of gave up that economic ground. Now, it was going to be impossible for the NDP to own the issue of the economy, but I don't think it was a wise strategic move just to surrender the economy. The election was about the economy. Jason Kenney was absolutely right when he stood behind a podium that said jobs, economy, pipelines. It's what the election was about. And every time the NDP wanted to pull focus from that, they wanted to talk about Jason Kenney's past, they wanted to talk about gay-straight alliances, you know, then voters would say, we had a election panel that we were following through the whole election. And even people who were passionately supportive of gay-straight alliances would get frustrated and say, you know, as long as she's talking about that, then you know, then it doesn't give me confidence that she knows what this election is really about.
Thank you. John, I have to tell you, as an old historian, anybody I can't remember the last time Harold Adams Innis and the Staples thesis came up in a conversation, so thank you for that. You've made my day. but the point of the Staples thesis really is the fact that while you have dominant industries, over time you develop forward linkages, backward linkages, technology linkages, and that becomes the basis for a well-developed complex economy as we have in Canada, even though our growth poles, as economists call them, may be oil and gas or forestry or agriculture. And so the question is, if the global energy system is being transformed by new technologies, oil and gas finally have a serious competitor in electricity. If we know that the structural changes are coming, how then do we create a new narrative that can compete with the existing dominant narrative? Maybe a third narrative is what I've called it in the past. And how do we do that? Do we need leaders? Do we need visible people who have a platform and a megaphone to stand up and start talking about these? Do we need groups like Energy Futures Lab to start putting on conferences where people come together and talk about this? What's your take on that?
I do think it is a matter of leadership, either by individuals or parties or organizations, right? Like the Alberta Narratives Project tried to sort of do this at the grassroots level, saying, well, if we can get people to think about like common values and shared principles, that might work. And I mean, yeah, I'm sure they had a lot of great conversations, but that was 3-4 years ago, and I haven't heard anything out of that since. I think, to the writings of some people like Aretha von Herk, who, talks about, mavericity, right? The psychological disposition. So I think thought leaders, political leaders, organizations which take a leadership role. I mean, that's how, people's opinions can change, right? But it has to be done from this perspective where the leader becomes, a credible and empathetic champion for that, right? And does a good job communicating that narrative. And as you've already pointed out, the NDP tried to do that, but didn't do a very good job in their terms. So, either they need to do better or somebody else needs to take up that mantle of leadership.
I want to pump my tires a little bit here, or maybe pump Energy Media's tires. Most of you probably don't know, but a couple months ago we published the Energy Declaration, which was 12 principles that should undergird Canada's energy future and the transition to a low carbon future. And then as sort of an addendum to that, I wrote the hydrocarbon vision, which argued essentially what Mark Little argues, which is that we need to begin pivoting the oil sands from bitumen for fuels to bitumen for materials. That is the future of a prosperous Alberta in the long run. And I'll be doing other sort of vision chapters on that over time, some of which will deal with Alberta and some not. So what I tried to do was lay the foundation for that third narrative so that we could get away from this binary conversation. But here's a strategic question for both of you. And should we get together, as the Energy Futures Lab does, and in that Energy Narratives Project, and collaborate, bring in people with different views, sit around a table and try to find consensus going forward? Or should we take more of a dialectic approach where we have two camps fighting it, battling it out, and out of that conflict emerges a synthesis and a third way that we then can all get behind as a result of the conflict between the two dominant ideas? What's your take on that?
Well, I'm going to make a pitch for constructive dialogue and finding sort of the commonalities among people. As a pollster, I mean, I think where clients really get value out of what we do is we sort of lay the groundwork. Like, this is Alberta, right? You can fight you can fight what it is. You can say that Albertans are wrong, but this is who they are. These are the opinions that you have to work with. And I say to the clients all the time, you don't have enough money to change anybody's mind. What you've got to do is figure out where the mindset is at, figure out where the commonalities are at. So, I mean, if I'm A&W, and you don't eat beef, well, I'm not gonna, convince you to eat beef. I'm gonna give you a veggie burger, right? But if you're not gonna visit a fast food restaurant, I'm not gonna try and get you to visit a fast food restaurant. So, I think it's about understanding Albertans, understanding where the commonality is, and trying to bring people together on those sort of points of convergence. And one of the obvious points of convergence is the word diversity, right? That was something else that really comes through in the article that John wrote for CBC. There's a word cloud in there. And, you know, diversity is one of these words that you hear from both sides of the spectrum, because even people who are staunch supporters of oil and gas will talk about the need to diversify within that industry. Other people will talk about the need to diversify away from that industry. But what's really critical is all Albertans will agree that the fundamental flaw with our economy is that we're too dependent on one industry and we need to diversify. And John also mentioned this, you know, we had a question in there about whether people wanted more investment in technology and more promotion of the tech sector. And like overwhelmingly, I think the number was 92%, if I'm right, John, of people saying like, absolutely, we have to support the tech sector. So, you know, I think if we could sort of get into this conversation about diversifying the economy, moving it ahead, you know, getting away from the boom bust cycles, then I think you could ignite that sort of mushy middle who's just tuning out because right now the debate is too extremist for them.
The only thing that I would add to that is I think you will lose on if you take the dialectic approach every time, because the right has a structural advantage in Alberta because of federalism. You know, because the federal Liberals have tended to be in government, at the federal level, provincial Conservatives can always saber rattle, right? And that's where I think that federalism aspect gets layered on top of the ideology and the transition stuff, and that's why I think, you know, the dialectic approach will mean that you would lose, right? And so I think, you know, to everything that Janet said, it has to be that constructive collaborative approach, because you're going to lose if you try and sort of take that head on.
Well, this will be the last question, folks, and then we'll take some Q&A. So if attendees can formulate your question and put up your little blue hand, we'll get to you in just a few moments. So last question. It's no secret to anybody attending here, because most people will come from social media, where I tend to be highly critical of Jason Kenney's energy policies, climate policies, and general approach to energy, the energy discourse. And the same goes true of the oil and gas leadership. I've been very critical of them over the last 4 or 5 years for the way that they've dug in on the status quo. The status quo, in my opinion, is unacceptable. We have to all admit that change is happening, and we can debate how we adapt to that change and the policies that are required, the investments that are required. But fundamentally, we need to admit that things are changing, and conspiracy notions around climate change is a hoax, the energy transition isn't happening, really impede that kind of change in thinking that we need. So, given where that, I call it the Kenney camp, where they're at, how in the world do you begin to have this constructive dialogue with such a polarized debate, where that camp, I would argue, is dealing in mythology and irrationality, and in many ways just divorced from the data and reality? I know that sounds harsh, but I think that there's a good argument to be made that it's true. So what's your take?
Well, I think that I think that discussions happen on multiple levels, and that Twitter is the least constructive place where that happens. And so, and I'm not going to make a pitch here for the government. It's not my job to defend the government or anything, but they convey a very sort of elbows up, simplistic sort of dialogue on social media, because it gets them a lot of clicks, it gets them a lot of likes, it probably gets them a lot of donations to the party, right? But I don't think that, but I think when industry executives sit down with the energy minister, I think there's sort of a more elevated dialogue going on. The problem is I don't think we have any insights into those, other dialogues that are going on. So I think the approach on Twitter is not at all constructive, but I'm not sure that the goal of those people on Twitter is to advance the narrative. And I'm not in those closed door meetings. I surely hope that there's more constructive conversations going on in those meetings. And I can say that, you know, oil and gas executives that I sort of interact with because of the nature of my business, I know that they are thinking at a high level, that they are thinking 10, 20 years into the future, that they've moved beyond this idea of, you know, oil and gas will last forever. You know, I know that they're having those conversations. I just hope they're having them with government behind closed doors.
Well, before we get into the questions, and I'll ask Dale Marshall to ask his fairly shortly, but I want to make this just one observation, responding to your comments, Janet. And as a journalist, I, you know, cultivate sources in the industry, not so much in this government, I have to confess. They're not as friendly towards energy media, but nevertheless, I have plenty of sources. And unfortunately, I think in places where the conversation needs to be elevated, it is not always elevated. And that, I think, is a real problem. And I think within the industry, it's a much more fractured industry, where there are certainly some leaders and executives who are, you know, plugged into what's going on globally, and unfortunately, many are not. And that, just an observation. Okay, Dale Marshall, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Markham, and thanks, Janet, John. Really interesting stuff. I guess what I'm wondering is, there's obviously a lot of fear that's involved in discussions about transition in a place that obviously has a lot of like history and culture wrapped up around in the oil and gas industry. I'm wondering if the notion of transition support for communities and for workers, whether your research shows that talking about that, introducing those kinds of programs changes the math in terms of support versus you know, digging in the heels around transition.
Well, I think you'll hear, you know, if you sort of go out to places where maybe they've lost their coal plant and that sort of thing, and those people will talk about the fact that, you know, government hasn't done enough to help them transition away. But I think you've also got this other sort of fundamental problem in Alberta is, you know, the idea of sort of, you know, government handouts is kind of anathema to people, right? That you know, they don't want a handout. They don't want government to give them money. What they need to know is, like, how can I transition my mortgage from the current salary I'm getting, you know, to the next salary? But you know, one of the things I say about Alberta is, like, you know, Alberta is very much about, you know, its primary industries. It's very much about work too, right? There's so many of us that came from someplace else, and what brought us here was work. And there's something about, you know, when you take somebody's work away from them, you take their identity away from them. And so it's just not a case of, well, let's come up with the right government program. It's really, let's give people a real vision for what their lives, what a productive life could be after transition.
I think that's a fascinating insight, Janet. That's exactly right. And we haven't touched upon it in this conversation yet. But the role of technology like artificial intelligence and machine learning and automation and robotics and big data and analytics is literally transforming the oil and gas workplace in Alberta. And it doesn't get talked about enough. I've written about it. My first piece on it was back in 2017. And I remember oil and gas executives, a few of them, mocking me on Twitter, you know, and lo and behold, 3 years hence, and everybody's doing it, and it is, you know, we're seeing a sea change in corporate head offices in Calgary as a result. And that doesn't get enough attention, because that is very disruptive to people's lives and people's careers, and that, I'm sure, creates some tension and worry. Okay, Brian Heidecker, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Okay, thank you. And that interesting comments there, Janet and John, and a number of points I could make, but I think I'd like to focus on diversification. And we seem to have this mindset in Alberta that we haven't done very much in the way of diversification. And I keep reminding people, in 1951, we had 1 million people in this province. Saskatchewan had 1 million, Manitoba had 1 million. We're crowding the heck out of 5 million. We have built an enormous economy here. And yeah, oil and gas is still major, but I think underneath that, we've done an awful lot of diversification within that. And people are saying, oh, well, governments haven't done anything. Well, I don't accept that. And that. So the comment you made, we need a comfortable arena in which to conduct a thoughtful conversation. You said on energy, and I expand that to say on most everything. How and where does that conversation take place? Because I don't see it happening. That's my problem.
Yeah, well, what I'll say is, off the top, I mean, I'm a pollster, right? And so I often say to people, like, I don't deal in reality, I deal in perception, right? All we can do is measure people's perception. So you and I could have a good argument about whether diversification has or hasn't happened. The fact of the matter is if it has happened, people don't feel confident enough about it or sort of knowledgeable enough. And then, in terms of your, where do these conversations take place? I mean, geez, I don't know if as a pollster I'm really even, qualified to answer that, but I can say that, when I conduct a focus group, I have really productive conversations. And, people tell me all the time that, the population's getting more polarized, there's less civility, there's all of those things. Well, when I sit down and do a focus group, and of course I can't do it during the pandemic, but when I sit down and do a focus group, I mean, those conversations are sort of as civil and as productive as they were when I did them 25 years ago. Yep. And I'll get back to, bashing Twitter. I think I think we're sort of like using the wrong tools for the job. And it's like, let's get off Twitter. Let's stop thinking that we're going to sort of solve this on Twitter. So I guess to answer your question, I know where the arena is not. Exactly where the arena is probably for, for someone else to answer.
I just want to give a shout out to Markham and thank you for putting on this series. I think conversations like these have a big role to play. And the less the less we have of the political partisan talking head format on the 6:30 news and more of having, well, let's have other people who are, not necessarily non-ideological, but are going to question the ideological orthodoxy, right? Like I think about how Ken Bosenkool is quite critical of the provincial government, advocates for some right of center ideas that depart from sort of the partisan orthodoxy that the UCP sticks to. I mean, I think those are the kinds of voices that we need because, the NDP provincially took a leadership role in questioning left-wing orthodoxy. And I want to see conservative intellectuals question the UCP. And they're out there, they're saying things, but I think they need to be amplified. And it's, through forums like this, through, like the CBC's like West of Center podcast, which tries to highlight different voices. I think those are where we find those conversations. And the more those get out there, I think that's when you start to see that interaction from elite level discourse to
well, and one of the interesting things about the pandemic is lots of people are hosting these kinds of conversations, right? So it'll be interesting to see what sprouts from these things. I mean, the chambers of commerce are having these kind of discussions. The Business Council of Alberta, my book club always has 15 minutes of talk over Zoom while we're doing Zoom book club meetings. So I think it's, people are far less offensive when they're face to face with each other, or at least, avatar to avatar with each other.
Well, that's a very good observation. And let's not get into a discussion of my Twitter habits. Just a little, before we call on Dave, a little bit of an observation about the Business Council of Alberta, because that's a fascinating group. I really like them a lot. And they're kind of a Chamber of Commerce type organization. But if you take a look at their membership, I mean, all the heavy hitters, WestJet and Suncor and Cenovus and big banks and so on are part of that. But I've interviewed Adam Legge, their CEO, a number of times. I've interviewed Mike Holden, their economist, a number of times. And they are a much more progressive, that sort of progressive business community approach. And I think that's why they started that group, is because they felt there was a need for that voice in the public discussion in Alberta. And they've called for some very progressive things. And so everybody, I think you should keep an eye on that group, Business Council of Alberta, Adam Legge. I think that they're going to be key players in the conversation over the next year or two. Okay, Dave, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Sure. Just the observation more of, I'm an IT guy in education, and we spent millions of dollars in IT, bringing all of us propeller heads together to do all these wonderful things in IT till we read this book by this Everett Rogers guy on diffusion of innovation. And I think this is what Alberta's missing. We're talking about an innovation, but when we get change agents in, like I was, the research from Rogers, should we actually hurt the process? That's why some of Markham's work's so neat. Yeah, he hits people in the head with a hammer sometimes, but he also talks about you getting 2 to 3 times the value for your bitumen, turning it into carbon fiber. And so we need, what Roger says, it's not change agents. You need opinion leaders. The guy next door who's got an F-350 who hauls his camper every weekend, he shows up with a little Prius in the driveway saying, yeah, I didn't get to work and do this. Or the other guy who's going, yeah, I didn't get a new air conditioner. I got this thing called an inverter. I can heat my house up to -20 now. And I think, to me, that's what's missing in this whole discussion is, it's not stay away from the change agents. They are important, they're early adopters. But how do we, because Canada needs Alberta's investment, its oil, it's everything. How do we get those opinion leaders cooking on this is what I'm looking at.
That's a great question, Dave. Janet or John, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that point that I made before, right? Like as a pollster, my job is to sort of figure out where public opinion is, and I think a lot of change agents miss the point, right? They know their point of view, and they can't appreciate another person's point of view. And I think what you have to do is understand where Albertans are coming from, and work what and find the values that meet up with your values, and then play on that. So yeah, we have an abundance of big trucks here in Alberta. We live in obscenely large houses here in Alberta, but we are some of the most diligent recyclers in the country. Like I think the last I saw, we return 80% of our cans and bottles, right? So and it's a bad stereotype to say that Albertans don't care about the environment. I mean, we love the environment, we live within it. So find that commonality, play into that, and because if you're not, you've got to understand the language people are speaking and speak that language back to them. Otherwise, you're speaking Greek.
Well, I really agree with that. And it was a very good question, Dave. And because really part of Energy Media's mission here is to position us as opinion leaders on the energy transition and climate change and so on. And I'd encourage everybody, go to our website and you'll find on the navigation bar, you'll see a link to the Energy Declaration, and the hydrocarbon division is linked in that document. And have a read, see what you think, because we are trying to change the conversation in Alberta, in fact in Canada, around energy. And if you like what you see, then please promote it within your network. So, okay, James Van Leeuwen, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Thanks, Markham. I'm going to preface my question with a point about energy transition, that it's actually a reality that's been ongoing for a couple of centuries now, since the Industrial Revolution, and it has never stopped. We're always in a state of energy transition, and sometimes it accelerates because of a technological innovation. And it is happening here in Alberta, even if our premier and others might not want to recognize that fact. In rural Alberta especially, there are countless stories to tell about energy transition as a fact on the ground, whether it's Hutterite colonies adopting solar at a rate that would probably blow most people away. Albertans would be shocked to understand how far solar has already penetrated into some areas of the ag industry and so on. So it's a fact on the ground out here. Of course, we have the wind energy down here in my corner of the province, that's Pincher Creek area, and we've been a wind energy capital for the last 20, 25 years. So all these stories are there to be told. It's a matter of whether there's an audience for these stories. And the appetite for any particular kind of narrative relates very strongly to social identity. Does the narrative reinforce my idea of myself. And if it doesn't, and worse yet, if it actually confounds my idea of myself, I don't want to hear that story. So I'm trying to tie together some of the ideas that have emerged here in the discussion, especially the thoughts, especially the one around how do we actually get the stories out there? How do we really cultivate these narratives when, especially on the part of the older generation here in the province, there really isn't that much of an appetite for this new idea of ourselves here in Alberta. I see younger generations as being certainly the most receptive, and perhaps that's where we need to be looking for leadership. And so I want to throw it over to Janet and John here to comment on that.
I think, that's an excellent point, and you mentioned social identity. Like, social identity theories is a big part of like what I research academically, and it informed the piece that I wrote. And that's exactly why this is so difficult, because people have Albertans have this perception that, their identity as being tied to oil is fixed, when really that didn't come from nowhere, and that is not fixed, right? Like, we got there for a reason, and we can go away from that too if we think about it and are deliberate about it, right? And so that's where I think shifting the focus to, like shared values, shared dispositions, like that is a pathway, because it avoids, this thing that we're fighting over. It goes to somewhere where we have common ground, and kind of like what Markham was saying before. It's like, well, how can we use that common ground as a bridge to get somewhere other than where we are currently, right? So no, I think that's an excellent point. I think you've hit the nail on the head. Like, it's the fact that our identity is tied to this stuff that makes it so difficult to have productive conversations, unless you sort of, take that initial step to frame the identity as being grounded in something else, and then that allows a different path forward.
Okay, Jeff Rutherford, you'll be the last question. If you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Yeah, thanks for the conversation, Janet and John. This is more I think about it, this is definitely what we need to be talking about. My question is about diversification, and how you said that there's this was sort of common ground that you found in your polling, and it was something that was touched on by our two polarized corners. But diversification could mean a lot of different things. If you were to ask folks in BC and Ontario, they would talk about a just transition in Alberta to different sources of energy. But what diversification could also mean is a shift in the Alberta economy to tech, or like Markham's doing with his research, it could mean bitumen to materials, and using and leveraging our oil and gas sector to do different things for us. And I'm guessing that the openness from different communities to diversification will be very different depending upon how you would actually define it. So one thing I'm interested in is how can, in this narrative that we're developing for Alberta, we really need to understand the openness of different groups in Alberta to how they can adjust to this new reality. So I was wondering if in your focus groups and in your conversations with different people in Alberta, what does diversification actually mean to them? And along that sort of spectrum of different options, what is people's comfort level with where our new leaders, whoever they are, what's their comfort level with these different options?
Well, there's a great diversity in terms of how people see the issue of diversification. And just like you said, there's going to be obvious differences between, different provinces, but even here in Alberta, we haven't even gotten into this. We've been talking about Alberta like it's some sort of monolith, right? But like Calgary and Edmonton are just, are completely different. I've said this before, people in Ontario, think Calgary and Edmonton are like Kitchener and Waterloo, like just variations on a theme, but they're two very, very different political environment. So you've got the Calgary versus Edmonton, and there's going to be different definitions of diversity between those two cities. Then you've got sort of rural versus urban, and again, like there's, you know, if there's an economic crisis in Alberta as a whole, you know, it's even more pronounced in the rural areas. So, you know, you can talk about machine learning and you know, and high tech and stuff like that. You know, that's probably going to stimulate people more in Edmonton, where there's different things going on in the post-secondary institutions. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but I think as long as you have an overarching narrative and you've got people coming to a common ground, you know, that's the first step. And then, you know, if you're going to have a conversation about diversity in rural Alberta, obviously it's going to play out differently than it is in Calgary or Edmonton. But the fact that we can have sort of a common narrative driving a conversation, I think would be a big step forward in Alberta.
Well, we've come to the end of the Zoffi, and I want to thank Janet and John for taking the time out of their busy day to come and chat with us. So thank you, folks. This has been a fascinating discussion. We've been recording the Zoffi. It'll be up on our YouTube channel. You can search for Energy Media, and I'll be distributing it on our Twitter and Facebook accounts as well. So thank you again, and we'll look forward to chatting with you in the future about this.
Thanks a lot, Markham.